Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here, and this week we are excited to welcome a special guest, Dr. Sierra Burton. She is the daughter of Dr. Mark Burton, my usual co-host, and she is joining us to talk about sleep training in kids. So we had a listener email, and we're going to refer to him as John Doe. So he emailed us requesting information about sleep training his 2-year-old. And I think this is something that a lot of parents are going to be able to relate to, because I'm sure he is not, in fact, I know he's not the only parent who has waited too long to sleep train. I fall in that category too. And I totally get it. So I want to start by having Dr. Sierra Burton introduce herself. So she's a pediatrician. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Sierra Burton, as you so kindly said. I'm a general pediatrician, so I practice in clinic basically. And I would say that talking about sleep is something that happens a lot. A lot of families have a lot of questions about healthy sleep, but also sleep training. And we get this question all the time of, is it too late? And short answer is no, it's never too late.
Right. Okay.
Currently, I practice under my former married name, Sierra Party. If anyone's Googling me, they won't find a pediatrician under Sierra Burton yet, I think.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so let's start by talking about why sleep training matters. Maybe get into why it matters for kids, why it's important.
So first of all, I think it's helpful to define what I mean when I say sleep training, because I think different people might bring different things to that conversation. When I say sleep training, what I mean is a strategy to change one sleep habit for another sleep habit.
Okay.
So I think a lot of people feel like there's maybe a little bit more of a right way to sleep train and a wrong way to sleep train, but I don't think that particular mindset works very well for most of us. So really, that's what it is. It's figuring out a strategy for changing one sleep habit for another. And I would say in general, the goal is healthy sleep for everyone in the home. So healthy sleep for the kids, healthy sleep for the grownups. And the reason why healthy sleep for kids is important is because a ton of our brain development happens while we're asleep. Like when we sort of collate what happened during our day and we process the things that happen to us developmentally. And so healthy sleep is actually really key for healthy development for kids, but also for kind of healthy learning during, the elementary school years.
Right.
So if you're not having healthy sleep, then it makes it really hard to learn. And then for the adults in the home, if the adults are not having healthy sleep, as a parent, it makes it so hard to be your best parent self. If you're sleep deprived, it makes it hard for you to be available to any parent partner that you have. It makes it hard to succeed in your job and your personal life. I mean, there can be a lot of things that can affect children indirectly when the parents in the home aren't having healthy sleep. So that's the goal of sleep training, is healthy sleep all around.
Right. And Mark and I, we talk about this all the time, that sleep is essential for good mental health. Whether you struggle with the mental health issue or not, sleep is important, really important. And I think you're right that when we don't get good sleep as parents, our parenting suffers. Not that we can't still be good parents without proper sleep. I mean, think of the newborn years. I didn't get good sleep particularly with my last two kids. I managed to function and I survived. But I think it's good to have all of the tools we can in our belt and, to get as much information as we can. So I'm going to go ahead and read a story from one of our listeners, and we're going to refer to him as John Doe. And so he emailed about his daughter, and this is their first kid. And I totally can relate to this because we put off sleep training as well. And so she co-sleeps with both of her parents. and they both love it, and they recognize that maybe it's gone on for too long. And so one of the things that he said is that even when she naps during the day, one of them is lying next to her. And it's mostly been his doing. He owns that. And he admits, he's like, it started as I just wanted to soak up every minute to probably waiting too long and then getting into a bad habit because it was convenient. And so they're at a point where they're like, okay, we know that she's going to eventually have to sleep in her own bed. And I think I want to start by assuring John Doe that 12-year-olds do not sleep in their parents' bed. So, one way or another, eventually your child will sleep in their own bed. So let's start by talking about some tips for John and helping him to begin the process of sleep training his daughter.
So when I have this conversation with families, usually where I like to start is just by, number one, acknowledging that there are reasons why these patterns get set up, right? I think sometimes we can feel really judged, and I think it's important to be kind to ourselves and be like, there's reasons why we did this, and maybe now there's reasons why we want to make a change. So just kind of acknowledging that, like, no one had any nefarious intentions when we're setting up, kind of maybe some less than healthy sleep patterns. Number two, I think I get asked a lot of questions about what time should my kids go to bed? When should bedtime be? And to be 100% honest, I don't care so much about the bedtime of kids as how much sleep they're actually getting.
Right.
So to throw a couple of numbers out at you, and this is actually pulled kind of right off the CDC website. So healthy sleep for newborn babies is a ton. Newborn sleep, a ton. 20 hours a day, so much sleep. Once they kind of get out of that newborn period and they're older than about 3 months, it goes to about 16 to 20 hours total sleep in sort of a 24-hour period. So the toddler years, after a year, a healthy amount of sleep for a toddler is typically between 12 to 14 hours in a 24-hour period. So that includes naps. So maybe 12 hours at night and a 2-hour nap during the day, or, something like that.
Yeah.
And then in the preschool years, we're looking at kind of, 10 to 13 hours total in 24 hours. So that just kind of gives you an idea. If your kids are going to bed at 7:00 at night, but they're preschool age and they're only getting 8 hours of sleep a night and going to bed at 7:00, that still would fall under sleep that could be healthier, even though their bedtime is, quote, early, end quote.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about healthy sleep, we're talking about sleep amount, but we're also talking about sleep quality. And I would say that in some co-sleeping situations, that's the part that suffers maybe. Maybe we have good sleep amount, but maybe sleep quality, isn't great either for the children or for the parents. A lot of times I find it's the parent actually who really is having, disrupted sleep, and the kids are totally happy. They're like, what are you talking about? This is great. And I do want to put out there that if everyone is getting good amount of sleep and good quality of sleep, then that is a sleep habit that may not need to change right now. I think there's picking your battles and deciding, what about this are we wanting to change? So the first thing I would say to John is to say, is everyone getting good sleep amount and good sleep quality? And if the answer is yes, then knowing that maybe this isn't the time you want to pick this battle. Especially if parents are feeling ambivalence around changing it. So I find in my practice, the number one reason why sleep training doesn't work out is when parents aren't sure if they want to do it. Or one parent says yes, and the other parent's like, I'm really on the fence. Our kids are so good at picking up on those little cues when we're like not sure. And they will push every button we have. And then sleep training isn't successful. And then the parents feel like a real failure. And, so I would say the number one thing to do is sit down with your co-parent if you have one, or, just really introspect honestly and be like, how much do I want to change this right now or need to change this, kind of for parent sanity type thing. And if you've come to the conclusion, like, yes, it's time, we're doing this, we're all on board, then I would actually recommend sitting down and writing out a strategy, writing out your plan. When it's written down, it is so much easier to stick to a plan. And with sleep stuff, consistency and habit building is really what we're going for. As humans, our sleep is so habit-based. If we can do the same thing every night, we're so much more successful with that. And so if you have something written down that you can then refer back to, it just tends to result in a lot more consistency in changing that sleep habit. If the kiddos happen to be in two different households, then as much as you can coordinate with the other household and maybe just be like, hey, let's see if we can come up with a strategy that we can kind of both stick to. If you can't coordinate between the two households, because that totally happens sometimes,
right,
then I think it is okay to say, hey, there's different rules at that other house. Here's the rules at our house. And, just kind of be real consistent sort of in the environment you can control. And then the first step in things you would write down is what you want your bedtime routine to look like. I would say a lot of us have our bedtime routines develop organically, meaning it just kind of evolves from what we were doing before. And, a couple years down the road, we realize that we're reading 10 stories and 3 songs and 2 drinks of water. It's just like it becomes quite big.
Yeah.
And so I think it's okay to take a step back and say, what do you want the bedtime routine to look like? And, even write out that structure. And since what this is a strategy for changing one sleep habit to another, the same strategies that work for a 6-month-old are not going to work for John's 2-year-old. So you really need to meet the child kind of where they're at developmentally. And so John's 2-year-old, let's start with that group. Typically, a 2-year-old, one of the challenges you run into is that kiddo is starting to really be cognitively aware of the world around them, and change can be scary.
Yes, and they fight it.
Yes, they don't like change, which, that could be a statement about humans in general, how we don't really like change. And so that means that a lot of our strategy should be around making it not scary for the toddler. So you want to be open and upfront about it and say, hey, we've been talking, co-parent, or I've decided, I think, it's time that we do some big girl or big boy sleeping. And you can say it's not going to happen right away, but we're going to start to make that change in 5 days, 3 days, 7 days. You can pick a time. Kids in the toddler age group are super visual. So if you put a little calendar on the wall with maybe even just a tiny little sticker so that they kind of know that it's coming. And then use that time to help them build a space that's sort of their own that they can enjoy and like. So if they're in a room with a sibling, kind of have a bed of their own that maybe they can pick the sheets, maybe they can pick the comforter, maybe they can pick what stuffies they want to be on that bed. Maybe they can, practice putting their stuffies to bed in that bed. So kind of giving them some ownership over that space and a space that they really, like and enjoy. And then kind of when the day comes when you're really going to make this change, just kind of gently remind every so often, hey, remember, we're going to do a different pattern today. Here's what it's going to be. And you can walk through that bedtime routine, and then you're going to sleep in your bed. There are a couple of different ways that you can make that even gentler for kids. One is that parents can actually spend the first little while in the kids' room, just getting them used to sleeping in a different space, but the parent's still there. And the eventual goal is to kind of, move the parent out of that room. But getting the kids used to sleeping in that different space in the toddler age, to be honest, is probably 90% of your battle, So, so if you do your good bedtime routine, and then instead of going, to your own room, go to the child's room, lay them down, and maybe you lay down with them, depending on, if it's a twin bed instead of a
right.
Bed. And you sort of recreate the same, most of the environment that the kid was used to sleeping in, just in a different space. And I actually find that can be very successful, that kind of strategy. We want to avoid increasing anxiety if we can, because whenever we increase anxiety, it makes it hard for sleep to happen, but it also makes it harder for our brains to adjust to a new thing.
Right.
So a typical time frame for a new sleep habit to kind of really be established in an adult is 2 weeks. And that's our brains don't like to change very much. We're us older folks, we have a hard time around flexibility. Kids are a ton more flexible, and usually they can get a new sleep habit down within a week.
Okay.
The exception being if there's a lot of anxiety coming into play, that can really stretch that time out. So we want to kind of, mitigate that anxiety where we can. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's usually a pretty good starting point for the toddler age group. And then after a week, so implement your strategy, do it consistently for a week. And at the end of a week, reevaluate and come back and say, what about our strategy seems to be successful? What about our strategy could maybe use some tweaking? And if the kiddo is used to sleeping in their own space and they're falling asleep in their own space with the parent there, and it's like, wow, this has really worked, then maybe the strategy can change a little bit and say, all right, now we're going to tweak it
Mm-hmm.
where the parent is sitting next to their bed, but not in bed with them. So right there, even hand on them, even touching, but not in bed with them. So, kind of those, I would say once a week reevaluation and adjustment as needed. And that
Yeah.
would be my advice to John.
Okay, yeah, sounds great. And what I really love about it is that it's more of a gentle approach because I think most parents tend to respond better to that. And I also want to acknowledge something I've acknowledged before on this show is that there's no right way to be a parent. I mean, there's certainly wrong ways to be a parent, right? But there's no right way to do this. And the other important thing to acknowledge is every kid is different. And so I think really what it comes down to is what are you as a parent comfortable with and what's going to be best for your parent, which is what John is looking for.
That is so true. I think that's a really important point. Something that works really well for one family, for many reasons, isn't going to work well for another family. So that is why I think kind of that first step of just sort of sitting down and finding your strategy and like, what can this family do? What can John's family do? What will work for them?
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. That's key because, if we're trying something that John's like, I don't know, this probably doesn't fit with us, that's not very likely to be successful. And that can be
Right.
very frustrating. And then there's kind of this cloud over it, like, oh no, sleep training didn't work,
Mm-hmm.
and you sort of bring this anxiety forward into future attempts. So I think that's great. That's a really good point is that, if families are kind of thinking through the things I'm saying and they're like, I don't know if that'll work for us, that is really important for the family to listen to that and be like, yes, every strategy is going to be different.
Yeah. And so, because with John, it sounds like his ultimate goal is to have his child sleeping in her own bed. And I think that it's okay if that happens incrementally, I guess, or maybe sleeping independently. I like the idea of going from falling asleep in mom and dad's bed to falling asleep in my own bed with mom and dad still there. I think
Mhm.
that's a really good way of kind of gently doing it and kind of phasing her out. I mean, because we are creatures of habit, and this is 2 years of sleep habits established. And, you're not just going to be able to break that overnight. So it's going to be a process. And the other thing that I think I want to reiterate is consistency is key. If you give in just one night, you will regret it. And that's something I've learned from personal experience. You have to be as consistent as you possibly can. Obviously, life gets crazy and sometimes things happen, but wherever possible, try to be consistent. And I think another thing that parents should plan on is setbacks or regressions. You may feel like, hey, we've got this down and our sleep's going great 1 week, and then the next week it's going to be awful. I think that's natural, that's normal. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something wrong. It's a process.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that can be why it can be useful to reevaluate, roughly once a week,
Mhm.
what worked about this past week, what didn't. And that way families can really sort of refine their strategy moving forward.
Mhm.
And I agree about the consistency 100%.
Yes.
That is absolutely key. And that's
Yes.
why having a written plan can be helpful sometimes. That I think increases our consistency when we can refer back to like, oh, right, that's what we said we would do.
Yes, consistency. And I think that's why kids thrive so much on a routine, on a bedtime routine. And, it looks different for every family. I mean, ours is pretty simple. So I have never been a co-sleep mom. I know a lot of parents like co-sleeping, and I know that pediatricians, I think they usually recommend kids sleep in their own bed, correct?
Yeah, so co-sleeping we think can be a risk for safe sleep
Right.
when babies are very young. So the recommendation is in the parent's room, but in their own bassinet or crib
Yes.
until 6 months old. And
Okay.
then, at 6 months, I think is when a lot of us are comfortable saying, all right, that kiddo could transition to their own space or own room. Plenty of parents keep their infants in their room all the way up, longer than that. And that's fine too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was never able to co-sleep. Now, don't get me wrong. I had my desperate nights, particularly with my third child. He was an awful sleeper. I mean, just horrendous. He's still not a great sleeper and he's 2.5. So, some kids are just temperamental with their sleep like that. And so with my first daughter, we were never co-sleepers, but I was definitely a cuddle until you fall asleep mom. That's always been my method of sleep, and it's worked well for us, and my kids love it. I love it because I get the snuggles. And oddly enough, we didn't really regret it so much with our second because, I mean, she was just an easy sleep trainer, and that was just, I guess, luck. But with my first, we would stay in her room until she fell asleep. And my goodness, sometimes it would take her hours. When she was 3 years old, I was pregnant with our second, and my husband was working from 1 p.m. to 10 p.m. And at that point, I'm like, okay, this baby's going to be here. And our original method is not going to work. Like, it's not going to work for me to sit in her room every night and wait for her to fall asleep. And she was 3, and so she was old enough at the time to understand. And we tried to keep it pretty simple. We had 2 rules. The light stays off and stay in your room. And beyond that, we didn't care what she did. And my goodness, I have some hilarious pictures of her falling asleep in the oddest places because she would just play in her room until she fell asleep. And she fell asleep doing whatever she happened to be doing. And sometimes that was reading a book or playing with toys. That's what worked for us. Every family is different. Every kid is different.
Absolutely. And so the anecdote that you told has a couple of really good observations. One is that you're not fighting battles that you can't win, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I think as a parent, that's super important. If you can't win the fight, don't fight the battle.
Yes.
Yeah. And sort of deciding what is going to work for your family, and if what works for your family is, you do it on your own time in your own room. I mean, that I would say is a really healthy sleep habit. Like that teaches the skills of self-soothing, that teaches the skills of kind of, sort of being on your own. She's having an enjoyable time. We don't want bedtime to feel bad or, anxious or like the kiddo, if they go into it feeling like they really are at big risk of misbehaving and getting in trouble, that actually can create a lot of anxiety around bedtime.
Yeah.
And so, no, I think that's an absolutely great way to do it. That sort of that mindset of what's going to work for us.
Mm-hmm. We also used a sticker chart too, and that helped. And how the sticker chart went, because she's old enough to understand, if you stay in your bed, you get a sticker the next day. So if you stay in your room, or sorry, not in your bed, in your room.
In your room,
she didn't, yeah, she didn't have to stay in bed. This was more about just her going to sleep on her own. And that worked well, and that helped it to be kind of a positive thing. And I think that's something that we've talked about overall is try as best as you can to make this a positive experience. And it's maybe not going to always feel positive, and it's probably not always going to feel pleasant because, I mean, it's going to be a battle and they might fight it, but do your best to make it a positive thing as much as you can.
And this is something my dad, Dr. Mark Burton, is more of an expert with than I am for sure. But when we acknowledge and validate the feelings that our children are experiencing, that can be very powerful too. So when your kiddo keeps running out of the room and they keep coming to find you, just even that you don't want to fall asleep by yourself, or you don't want to fall asleep in this new room, or, you really want me to be there, can be very powerful in terms of just letting that kiddo know that they're heard, their experience is valid. So the other thing that I think can be good to mention is that we should look around to see what things we might unintentionally be doing that can make sleep hard or harder. I would say, like, for grown-ups, the classic grown-up example is caffeine, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
drink a bunch of caffeine afternoon, it's probably going to be hard to fall asleep that night. And so for younger kids, I mean, hopefully caffeine's not the issue, although I have
Mm-hmm.
had that come up in a couple of families. But if you're doing sort of big, rambunctious, excited play right before bed, that
Mm,
can make it really hard to fall asleep, actually. Or if we're doing movies or screen time right before bed. So
mm,
most of us have probably heard by now that our screens, our iPads and TVs and things, our phones emit a blue wavelength of light that our
mm-hmm.
brain interprets as it being morning time. And so essentially, if we're watching screens right before bed, there's this strong signal, get up, it's morning. And it takes our brain about an hour to sort of get over that signal after the
Mm.
screens turn off. So that means that one way we can help sleep be better is if we kind of make sure we turn the screens off an hour before bed.
That's a really good tip for parents, and I think one that we could all use reminding of. I know I certainly can. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about sleep training earlier. So, in your experience, what is the best age to sleep train? And I'm going to take a guess and say that it depends on the kid. So, correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, and the family, right? There's a lot that goes
Yes.
into this. So I would say it actually depends probably more on the parents than
Fair
on
enough. Fair enough.
the children
Yeah.
when we're talking about the infant years. So number one, again, and this is largely, so I just want to make it clear this is me and my practice and what's been
Hmm.
successful for my patients. I don't know, that the National Sleep Foundation would 100% be behind these recommendations, but
Okay.
I almost never tell people to sleep train before the age of 4 months. And
Okay.
the reason is that, until we're about 4 months old, our sleep architecture, like if we're, doing kind of those fancy EEG hats and measuring brainwaves and
Hmm.
stuff like that, is pretty disorganized. As infants, we, just really, we're not very organized sleep structure wise. And
Okay.
then at around 4-ish months is when that really sort of starts to mature. And of course, sleep patterns aren't exactly the same as adults, but they become a lot more structured and a lot more
Hmm.
organized.
Hmm.
I feel for most families, the less than 4 months is like kind of what you described. It's just survival mode. It's like,
Yes.
what do we got to do to get everyone through this?
Yep.
Um, and there are a lot of different strategies that, that we can talk to families around that, but it's not really the same thing as sleep training. And then I usually tell families between, about 4 and 6 months, a lot of families are able to identify a period of time, usually 1 to 2 to 3 weeks, where all of a sudden the sleep seems to change for their
Hmm.
baby, their infant, and it becomes disrupted, or the kiddo is like, whatever was happening isn't working anymore. And I think that interval, if you can catch it and find it, is a great interval to sleep train in, because
Okay.
really what that is that sleep architecture changing and maturing, and that kiddo trying to figure out what is my sleep habit now. And so we can sort of naturally segue that into like, all right, let's do a, maybe we can
Hmm.
have a true sleep habit. So for that infant age group, same thing, routine is absolutely key. So having a bedtime routine, which can be sort of as short or as long as you want. Like you pointed out, it doesn't have to be hours worth of elaborate,
Hmm.
structure, but you do want to be very consistent and do the same thing for about the same amount of time every night. Usually, I start recommending that people move their infant into their own space, like into their own room, if they're going to be sleep training. In my experience, if you sleep train but have the infant in the room with you,
Hmm.
they know you're there and they can tell. And
Yep.
it can be very hard and frustrating. And I have a lot of parents who kind of, start sleep training, but then give up in that situation, which, I
Hmm.
mean, contrary to popular belief, that's not like the end of the world. It just, kind of adds this burden on the parent of like, oh my
Right.
God, I tried and it didn't work out. And I think, there's no guilt like parent guilt, right? So I find that I have a little bit more success when I, have people kind of move the baby into their own space. And then this is my own method. This is a mishmash of the Ferber method.
Okay.
So it's really not exactly cry it out. I think the hard thing with cry it out, when you just kind of
Hmm.
put them down and leave, that's a safe thing to do, but it is so hard on parents, like to sit
Yes.
there and just know that your kid is suffering. I mean, I find a ton of my families who just do that method don't have success with it
Mm-hmm.
because it's so hard as parents for us to listen to that. So what I recommend to families is do your good bedtime routine, put your baby down kind of in their own crib, their own space, big kiss, I love you, leave the room, and set a timer for however long you think you could listen to them cry. It
Mm-hmm.
could be 7 minutes, it could be 10 minutes, it could be 15 minutes. The actual interval isn't as important as, kind of what will work for that parent, for those parents.
Yeah.
Um, and then at the end of that time, when your timer rings, go back in. I think it's totally fine to pick kiddos up and snuggle them. You'll find, some internet sites that say, oh, leave them in their crib. I don't know. I don't notice any disruption really when you really pick them up and give them good snuggles. But, again, whatever works for the family. If you'd rather
Mm-hmm.
just pat them on the back, that's fine too. Kind of get them soothed, calm, kind of ready to fall asleep again. Put them down in their crib, leave, set your timer again for the same interval that you used before.
Okay.
There was one piece of advice that I've seen on the internet that I really don't think is right. The internet talks about stretching out that time interval and gradually increasing it over time.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what that does, though. It makes that kiddo be like, they came back at 5 minutes, and this time it was 7 minutes, and this time it was 9 minutes, and I don't know what's going to happen. It's that consistency that we're
Okay.
talking about, right?
Yeah.
So if you stretch that interval out, you make it so they can't predict when you're coming back in. That increases anxiety, and it's kind of like random awards, in gambling. That
Mm-hmm.
kiddo will just keep going forever because they're like, last time they came in, but it was just after I thought they would. I'm going to keep going forever.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's a real predictable interval, and it's 10 minutes every time. That is the most likely situation where that kiddo is going to be like, they're coming, it's fine, whatever, fall asleep, that kind of thing.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And, my husband and I, Curtis, we were one of the parents that we could never do the cry it out. It never worked for us because emotionally we just couldn't handle it. Even like 5 minutes of cry it out, it just never worked with us. And so, are there some alternative methods to cry it out at that age? Maybe you just start by sitting in the room with them.
I think if it works for the family, then it's a good strategy. The real
Okay.
goal of sleep training an infant is to have them fall asleep on their own in whatever environment they're going to be spending the night in.
Okay.
So the downside of, for example, rocking them to sleep in an armchair is that there's this phenomenon that humans have called sleep onset association.
Mm-hmm.
And what it means is that once we pass through that 4-month sleep maturation process, our brains want us to be doing the same thing all through the night as when we fell asleep. We all have periods where we rouse, kind of where our sleep is the very lightest and we essentially kind of almost wake up.
Mm-hmm.
If we're in the same situation where we fell asleep, we have a real tendency to fall right back asleep without anything else happening. But if we're in a different situation, our brains wake us up and be like, whoa, 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 you got to go back to what you were doing before in order to fall asleep again. So these are the kiddos who, get rocked to sleep maybe. So kind of are in their parents' arms,
Mm-hmm.
put down, and then 2 hours later are up and screaming and need to be held and rocked again in order to fall asleep. And, kind of that pattern continues through the night. Those would be kiddos who wake up very frequently, kind of maybe 3 or 4 times a night,
Yeah.
needing to be rocked each time to go back to sleep. And so one of my goals around, sleep training for that infant group is to get them used to falling asleep on their own so that they, will be able to put themselves back to sleep unless, there's some other issue like a big dirty diaper or hunger
Right.
or discomfort or that kind of thing. And so that's the disadvantage of, kind of physical contact. But I do think for a lot of kiddos, having their parent in the room but not doing physical contact can be challenging
Okay.
sometimes. Of
Yeah.
course, if it works for the family, absolutely. So what I tell my families who want to sleep train but really don't want to listen to their kids cry is just pick a really short interval,
Yeah.
3 minutes, 4 minutes. Kind of, it means you're in there very frequently. It means kind of a lot of work for the parent, but I think it can be pretty reassuring for the kiddo.
Yeah. And I think the other important thing to acknowledge too with sleep training and cry it out is it only takes a few nights, usually for most kids. So it's a miserable few nights and it's hard, but if you can get through it, then, oftentimes parents say their kids start sleeping beautifully.
Yeah. And it's that flexible baby brain,
Yeah.
so plastic changing all the time. So yeah, way more flexible than our grown-up brains.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I would say in my experience, usually you're looking at about 4 nights infant to really kind of complete sleep training. But I don't know, if it feels just awful, that
Mm-hmm.
might be a clue that that might not be a great strategy. So if it feels more like, hey, I'm helping you learn a new thing and I will help you and be here with you on this journey,
Mm-hmm.
that maybe is more the feeling that we want in our strategy. Whereas if we've got this feeling of, my goodness, I am just torturing my child, maybe we need to rethink that strategy a little bit.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge that, like us, maybe not all parents sleep train, at 4 to 6 months. I mean, there's no one right way to parent.
Exactly. And I even tell families that up front. I say, if this does not seem like something that you want to do right now, then this isn't the right thing to do right now. So I
Mm-hmm.
agree. So one of the interesting things is kids, infants, sort of tend to sleep in ways that are healthy for them almost no matter what. So let's go
Yeah.
to that example of the kiddo who wakes up very frequently in the night and needs to be rocked back to sleep. That kiddo is actually getting pretty good sleep for them. The
Mm-hmm.
parent's not getting very good sleep, but
Yep.
the kiddo is. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, even in that situation, it's not like we're causing harm to our child or anything
Yeah.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I really think of it as sort of, what is that family dynamic? And I have plenty of parents tell me we are not ready to sleep train. And it's like, great, that's awesome insight.
Mm-hmm.
That's really important to realize that now is not the time.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Sierra, for joining us today. This has been a fantastic conversation. So we've talked about sleep training kids. Now we're going to talk about sleep training yourself. So next week, Mark and I are going to get into good sleep habits. We want to talk about getting good sleep as an adult. So we're going to get into that next week. And in the meantime, I hope everyone has a great week. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.